Welcome, Michael Rakowitz. Thrilled to have you here. I'm just gonna, if you'll allow me, just kind of reintroduce you to everybody. Thank you so much for joining. For those of you who don't know Michael Rakowitz, he is a working artist and professor based out of Chicago. He teaches art theory and practice at Northwestern University, and he is the recipient of the 2020 Nasher Prize, which is in its 5th year and honors a sculptor who elevates our understanding of what sculpture means and the possibilities. So quite a prestigious award. And honestly, I think we'd be here for until midnight if I were to list all of your achievements, accolades, and accomplishments. So I'm going to keep that short, but welcome, Michael. We're thrilled to have you.
Thanks for having me, Brooke. Thank you.
And I also have to say it feels like a coup because you are not really a social media person. You're not on Instagram yourself personally. So this feels like a win for ARTnews. So I'm just going to launch into this very first question, which is admittedly a little lengthy, so bear with me. But, Michael, as doing some research on you, to call you a sculptor feels like a reductive way to describe you. You are beyond so much more than that. You have described yourself as somebody who creates encounters, someone who creates structures, and someone who creates objects. And then in others' words, you've been described as someone who reworks, you reimagine, you make objects reappear, and you re-articulate. So of all of that, what kind of resonates the most for you? How would you describe yourself?
Well, I describe myself as never any one thing. I prefer the complicated litany of things that probably fall better under the rubric of artist, which gives us permission, I think, to be many things. In the way that I wish that anybody's, identity would allow them to be many things. So yeah, I mean, I love being a sculptor. I also love being an artist and also somebody who is engaging with the world as somebody who's here for a very, kind of like limited period of time. But I think about sculpting as being something that is in my work quite a lot, not just as a method for the making, but also as a kind of understanding of like an exertion of pressure onto material that ends up shaping it. And so I've used that as a kind of way to also work in open systems, where the kinds of questions that I'm asking will be, formed in real time, sometimes in a surprising way where it's not even just my intentions that are willing it to be the way that it is. And so in that sense, I think sculpture is a good word for it. But the other part of your question about reappearing and remaking and reshaping, I also see myself as, just the latest, as a visitor, in a vector of time, that where there's been many different hands that have shaped the world that we're in, and there's going to be many that come after me. And so my relationship to those objects that I've been reappearing from places like Iraq are not just works that have belonged to a place that we can be disconnected from. It's just it happened earlier, and I'm here in dialogue with them now.
I love that. Very poetic, and I love your take on that. So you just mentioned Iraq, which takes us to my next question. You are the son of Iraqi Jews, and you grew up with your grandparents. And I love this quote so much. You said that they were the first installation artists and said that their experience was tinged with a broken-hearted longing for Iraq. And so for anyone meeting you for the first time, the influence of your heritage is very clear. and has guided you artistically. Would you say it's the greatest source of inspiration for you? And what is it that you're trying to bring to light?
Well, I think I'd probably not want to answer that second question only because I don't want to overdetermine or overburden the work for bringing something very specific to light that's maybe my own intentions. But I think one of the things that I love about art is that there's the ability for the viewer and the people that I'm making it who are in dialogue with it, that they're vital collaborators in the production of meaning. So I don't want to shut down the possibility that that the work is actually going to have layers added to it by the way that people experience it and make meaning from it. But I think that when it comes to something like where it is that my mother's family comes from and how it is that experience shaped me, I think about it as being, something that was arduous for them, being put in the position where they can no longer live in a city that they loved, identifying, as Baghdadis, when they left. I mean, they could have made their lives a lot easier for themselves by just assimilating in the United States. But the reason I call them the first installation artists that I ever met was because they made a place for me and my brothers, and before me, my mother, where everything that was on the floor was from Iraq, everything that was on the walls was from Iraq, what was coming out of the stereo during the family celebrations was from Iraq, and what was coming out of the kitchen was most definitely from Iraq. So it's a little bit like, my grandparents were able to cast the house in the smell of cumin, long before Rachel Whiteread cast the interior of a house in concrete. And I'm really grateful for that. I think it must have been very hard for them to continue to love a place that that they couldn't go back to. And so I feel as though a lot of the works that I've done have steadily dealt with notions of dispossession and displacement. And it's come through a lens that has involved architecture, it's involved cities. But one of the things that's really interesting for me is I sort of like psychoanalyze my own practice and wonder, like, how did I go from making shelters, which I continue to do every winter, to making food. And Michael Pollan wrote a book in 2005 called The Omnivore's Dilemma. And in that book, he explains that cities formed when people decided to cook together. And being able to kind of like continue to move from the facade of the building, to the person, but then sort of seeing that moment, the hearth of a building being the kitchen. I mean, where does everyone end up in a house party? They end up in the kitchen. And seeing it as a primal scene for why it is that we want to live together, and having it go back to Babylon. It seems like it's actually very consistent with the way that I've worked. So it's not just about the heritage, my own kind of like particular experience, which I'm grateful for. But I hope that, like, as we hold space with each other in cities, that we understand that sometimes going back to those primal scenes and why it is that we've decided we want to live together, that there's magic that can be generated in those craft experiences.
I think people have felt that magic this year at home with their families, so that resonates very powerfully. So let's go back to, I know I keep parroting your quotes back to you, but they really are profound. So you are quoted saying that objects tell you about themselves. And there is a very poignant scene that you've recalled in a few articles that I've read about you, where you're shopping for groceries in Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn. And it was a store that was frequented by your grandparents. And you stumble on a can of dates. And I think it's better for you to tell the story than for me to tell it.
Yeah, well, it was in 2004. It was a year since the sanctions were dropped against Iraq. A year after Bush had declared mission accomplished, and I went shopping at Sahani's importing company, and this has been, in a place that my family has made pilgrimage to ever since they arrived. I mean, that was the place that my grandparents went to get their Baharat spice mixes, and it is like it's an interesting story about what do people who are in diasporic communities do when they arrive to a new place. You you make your food. Um, and so I saw a can of date syrup. That I'd never seen before, and I grew up with my grandfather making the date syrup by hand, and he left behind all these jars of the date syrup after he passed away when I was very young. And I remember, quite a few years later, when we finished his last jar, my mother was complaining that the quality of the kinds of date syrups that she was getting at the grocery store, which were from places like Israel and places like California, filtered the date syrup too much to the point where it like literally lightened, the viscosity, and it tasted more like a honey.
Hmm.
And so this one said product of Lebanon, this can of date syrup. And so I thought, oh, this is something to try. Maybe my mother will love this. And I bring it up to the counter, and the owner, Charlie Sahadi, looked at it and he said, "Your mother's going to love this. It's from Baghdad." And so I looked at it again to make sure I wasn't hallucinating, and it said product of Lebanon. And when I asked him why, he explained that the date syrup is actually made in the Iraqi capital. It's put into large plastic vats, and then it's driven over the border into Syria, where it gets put into these tin plate steel cans that are food safe. And then it gets driven over the border to Lebanon,
Mm.
where it's labeled as product of Lebanon and is sold to the rest of the world.
Mm.
And from 1990 until that moment, this was one of the ways in which Iraqi companies had circumvented the UN sanctions.
Mm.
And when I asked why it was still in place a year later, he explained that anybody who's importing things from another part of the world, for instance, if they were importing something from Iraq that said that it was from Iraq, that they were going to, as importers, face these intensive scans from the US FDA and Homeland Security and Customs and Border Patrol, and the importer gets charged for those scans. And so he explained to me that it would be bad business. And then I thought that importing it to say that it was actually from Iraq would be good art. And it led to a project where I actually did that by reopening my grandfather's import-export company. But to your point about the object telling you about itself, what I saw in front of me was an object that couldn't tell me where it was from, an object that was too terrified to tell me where it was from, as if the pressures of xenophobia in this country had been exerted on this object to the point where it was too scared to tell me where it was from. And so, that's that story about that one object. But I feel as though the material culture that comes from the materials that I enlist to make my work are all part of that kind of dialogue that I have with objects.
I'm trying as you're talking. I wanted to show the facade of that import export. There's something funny going on with my picture function. So I apologize because I may not be able to pull up your works as we're talking. I don't know why it's being glitchy, but we'll just keep going. But it is such a, I think it's incredible that you then opened this import export, and that story is incredible. Um, let's talk. I know I'm going into some of your specific works, and I feel terrible because I can't figure out how to get this picture up. But The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist is one of the works you're most known for. And for anyone who is not familiar with it, you were commissioned to do the fourth and final plinth in Trafalgar Square. Is that correct?
Well, the fourth plinth it's a program that they have where they have different contemporary artists do these 2-year installations, and right now this wonderful work by Heather Phillipson is up there. Mine was on from 2018 until 2020.
So, and I'm so disappointed I can't show it, but it was a giant restored carved wing. I'm going to describe it if I can, if it helps people recall, carved wing creature, and it was a 1700 BCE bird that was destroyed by ISIS that you kind of resurrected and reinstated. So can you talk through it? You could speak to it far better than I can, but I'm going to see if I can find the picture while you're talking.
Sure. No, to be accurate, it was made in 700 BC, and it stood at the entrance of the Nergal Gate of Nineveh. And the Lamassu, which is the mythical deity that I've made or reappeared, I should say, was it had a human head and the body of a bull and the wings of an eagle, and it was a protective deity that was meant to protect the city, and it's an Assyrian symbol. So it was destroyed by ISIS in 2015, and it's an extension of a project that I began back in 2006 when I was sitting in that store that I had on Atlantic Avenue to attempt to import Iraqi dates. And while I was sitting in this store that was empty, I started to think about the empty museum in Iraq that I had seen on the television some 3 years before, when it was looted in April 2003. In fact, tomorrow is the 18th anniversary of the looting of that museum in the wake of the US-led invasion. And more than 15,000 artifacts were looted, and 8,000 of them still are at large. And so since then, my studio, which comprises over the years 40 different assistants, 40 different pairs of hands that have helped me to reappear life-size these artifacts. And they're made from the packaging of Middle Eastern foodstuffs and Arabic English newspapers. And so it's this compost of the discards of the food that allows for these cultures to continue in places where they flee to. But it's also that same skin of objects that can't tell you where they're from. And in the world of archaeology, an object holds its value because of provenance, because it can tell you where it was from. And so as I started to think about these objects being reappeared, I thought gypsum or limestone should not just be kind of brought back in a one-to-one way, but if they're going to be a ghost, they have to look different than they did in life. And so they wear the skin of these objects or these products that can't tell you where they're from. And so that piece in Trafalgar Square was the latest iteration at that point. And when I was nominated to make a proposal, I didn't know what I was going to do. And at the time, my studio and I were looking to reappear one of those colossal Lamassu, and we asked how big it was. We asked some people in the archaeological community, who told us it was 14 feet. And then some days later, I received the packet of information from the City of London to make a work on the fourth plinth, and the blueprints of the actual plinth were 14 feet. And so I thought to myself, what else would I do? Yeah.
That's fantastic. And you said there's 40 hands, so you work alongside a team of 20 in your studio in Chicago.
No. Over the years, so since 2006, there have been 40 different wonderful young artists who have passed through and have worked as assistants on the project. I currently have about 8 people that I work with.
Wow. Well, the scope of what you do, I mean, and all the projects are so personal and so unique. And this one particular, I found your work when you referenced it earlier about these structures that you're building yearly, called as part of your ongoing Parasites. So for those of you who don't, I'm saying it, it's Para, lowercase, and then all caps sites, like structures. So tell us, because this is obviously not a sculpture or stonework. This is completely different material, completely different concept. What is Parasites, and what was the inspiration behind these structures for the homeless community or communities?
So, Parasite is this ongoing work where I've been custom building inflatable shelters for unhoused people. And the structures themselves are attached to the exhaust ports of a building's heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system. So the warm air simultaneously inflates and heats these double membrane structures, and it's important that they're understood as double membrane because the person that's living inside them doesn't come into contact directly with the air. So the warm air circulates through a network of tubes that heats through conduction. And it's a project that simultaneously problem solves and trouble makes. I worked in graduate school with one of my favorite artists, Krzysztof Wodiczko, who made the homeless vehicle in the late 1980s. And he always described this way of working as a kind of way of working in the same way that a bandage happens. So the bandage simultaneously can do something like heal a wound, but it also communicates to the rest of the world visually that there is a wound. And so for me, I've grown up in cities all my life. I was raised outside of New York City, and so I saw the way that that unhoused people were eventually made invisible, that a city doesn't look to solve its unhoused problems, it looks to hide them. And I saw this as a kind of intersection with the story of displacement that my own family had. And I went to Jordan on a research grant in the mid-1990s as part of graduate school. And while I was there, I ended up doing all this research on the tents and the equipment of the Bedouin, the nomadic dwellers of the desert. And one of the details that I learned was that the tents are set up differently each night in accordance with the way that the wind patterns move through the desert. When I got back to the States, I had that detail that I thought was so poetic. And it was a winter of '97, and it was in Boston, and I saw an unhoused person sleeping underneath the vent of a building. And this was another kind of a wind. This was the wind that was the byproduct coming from one of the things that are materially missing in an unhoused person's life, which is a building, which is housing. And here were other nomads. These were urban nomads who are not nomadic by tradition, but are nomadic by consequence. And so I immediately did this cosmology in my mind about what it would mean to make that invisible air visible. And I started to work, on this concept that eventually I was able to work with people who actually live in our cities in this way, and who were excited to participate because it did something to kind of upend the invisibility that they are already sort of burdened by. And the title, is really kind of like looking at that word, which is the way in which a hyper-capitalist society regards people who are not able to kind of pay to live. But it's also a way of really interrogating the ways that like rescue devices get named. So in French, parachute means to guard against. Para means to guard against. Chute, falling, to guard against falling. Parapluie, to guard against the rain. Parasol, to guard against the sun. And so Parasite for me is to guard against the situation, to guard against this becoming a permanent solution. That in fact, what I am doing is problematizing the problem, and actual solutions do need to come to a radical overhaul of the way in which our cities are built, and in creating the conditions for a society that allows for people to live safely and with security, regardless of income status.
It's very noble, and I would imagine you've been met with resistance at certain points along the way, and it feels like this problem just keeps expanding, particularly now in this past year, in terms of the homeless crisis. But I think it's incredible, and I'm again so sad that I can't show an example, because it's really brilliant. And I hate moving on, but we are running out of time, and I want to make sure I ask you a few more questions. So a couple things just to lighten the mood slightly. Let's go to your creative process just for a second, because I was sort of fascinated by this idea that you have a chalkboard in your studio where you put your ideas. And I read that you have not erased anything that's been put on this chalkboard since the year 2015. I don't know if that is a myth or if that's true. What would, if I walked into your studio and found the chalkboard today, what might I find on it?
Well, let's walk into the studio and find the chalkboard.
Oh, how fun! We're walking, we're moving.
So yeah, so this is the chalkboard, and it's the residue of a conversation that I had with a curator who I love very much, Stephanie Smith, who I've worked with since 2005 on different projects. And one of the things that I love about making work is the opportunity to think with people. And Stephanie is one of those curators who thinks with artists, and I've had the pleasure of working with curators like Carolyn Christov-Bakarjiev, whom I consider family. You know, the ability to think with people is what makes me delight in doing what it is that I do and being an artist. And so Stephanie was at one point wanting to plan my first big project that would bring together all my projects in a kind of survey. And so together we made this this chart of how it is that all the projects connect. And it was such a wonderful conversation, and unfortunately we never got a chance to do the show. But I love looking at it because it's a conversation that I'll never forget, and who knows, maybe one day we will do that project. But it was you know, for me that felt like that was the reason that chalkboard was there, and I've left it that way ever since.
Well, you definitely have it sounds like your spirit of collaborating with others is great. And it's really nice to hear an artist talk about the power of being influenced and working with others to create what you do, that it's not everything is just solo. I do have to ask, just why have you never been to Iraq?
Well, when my grandparents left, they left because it was unsafe for them. I think, you know, as nationalist programs emerge around the world historically, you can point to every single situation, and minorities always suffer. So for them as Jews, they were unable to return. And for me, I've always felt as though I of being able to still be that and other things, you know, without having to necessarily just consummate going there. That doesn't mean I won't go there in the future, but it does kind of, you know, for me, relate in a way to those stories that my grandparents told me about this place called Baghdad. and knowing that that place is no longer that place, but it
Mm-hmm.
is another place, and to know that that I can interrupt that cycle of feeling unbelonged and dispossessed by reaffirming and renewing those practices to be there in one way or another, whether it's cooking, whether it's teaching my own children to cook those meals and to understand that that transmission of like the craft tradition of belonging happens in those moments, and that it's a way of pushing against and surmounting the ways in which power tries to separate people from belonging to certain places, and regardless of the way in which, you know, physically one might be kept from a place, that remembrance is an activation of being there. That said, I know many Iraqis now who are located all around the world who have said when they can go back, that I'm going to go and visit them, and that seems to me like a really good way to go.
Well, that feels like a great way to end. I just want to say, I mean, this has been so informative and inspirational. It feels like it would be hard to predict what you'll do next. And I certainly don't want you to feel like you have to put yourself in any type of a box of any sort. But is there anything on the near horizon that you could speak to that you're looking forward to professionally?
Well, I mean, I'm looking forward to being able to cook meals and invite people over for that. You know, so being able to return to a time when I can host in person would be wonderful. So yeah, I'm marinating things now, and and looking forward to us all being together, inshallah, sooner rather than later.
That sounds wonderful. Marinating literal food and marinating ideas, I'm sure. So, Michael, you've been a pleasure to have. It's been wonderful learning about you, and Art News is thrilled to have you. And congratulations again on your prestigious Nasher Prize for sculpture. I know it was 2020, but I know there's still a lot of celebrating that is to come. And we're just thrilled to have you here. We hope to talk to you and watch you and all that you
Thank you. I'm going to try really hard to earn it.
do.